Human Tempest-class battleships could not be unleashed in the impending Tzenkethi-Slasrithi War, or their deployment would trigger the release of a horrific nanoweapon doomsday swarm that would devour the entire galaxy. The pleading warning issued from Pixis's mouth. The Tzenkethi diplomat's normally blue skin paled to an icy white. Joseph Taylor listened to his old friend with narrowed eyes, his brow furrowed in confusion and dismay. As a veteran human military strategist, he struggled to comprehend why exactly the most powerful ships ever built couldn't be used to swiftly end the conflict before it began. The two stood facing each other in a Spartan, unadorned room, deep in the bowels of a remote Tzenkethi space station. Pixis had risked everything to arrange this clandestine meeting, desperate to prevent the unthinkable from being unleashed. After decades of fragile peace, we're on the precipice of total war with the Slasrithi Empire, Pixis said, anxiety lacing his voice. My people need Earth's help to survive, but not your battleships, anything but your God's-damned battleships. Joseph shook his head. Pixis, you're not making sense. A single Tempest could destroy their whole fleet in an hour. Why the hell would... You don't understand. Pixis slammed a fist against the wall. If the Tempests warp in, we'll have no choice. We'll have to use the Doomsday Swarm. Joseph blinked. The what? What the fuck are you talking about? Pixis explained in halting words. Long ago the Tzenkethi crafted the Doomsday Swarm, self-replicating nanites that consumed all matter to stop an extragalactic threat. The swarm worked too well. It ate half the galaxy before it could be contained. If human battleships entered the war, the Tzenkethi would see no alternative but to unleash the swarm again. Pixis gripped Joseph's shoulders. You have to convince your leaders. Send anything else. But if the Tempests come, the swarm will devour the Slasrithi, the Tzenkethi, humanity, everyone. It won't stop until the whole universe is gone. The dizzying journey back from the remote Tzenkethi station left Joseph Taylor reeling, his mind awhirl with the revelation of the Doomsday Swarm. Each parsec crossed felt like a countdown to oblivion, an inexorable march towards a cataclysm that would consume not just the warring empires but the entire galaxy. As his ship docked at the orbital tether, Joseph steeled himself for the battle ahead, not against the Slasrithi, but his own people. He knew convincing Earth's leadership to hold back their mightiest weapons would be a Herculean task. The Tempest-class battleships represented the culmination of human ingenuity and military might. To let them sit idle while humanity's allies bled, it was unthinkable. The tether ride down to the Pentagon was interminable. Joseph paced the length of the car, his mind racing through arguments and counter-arguments, searching for the words that might sway even the most hawkish admiral or politician. At last he found himself in the briefing room, a windowless vault deep within the labyrinthine complex. The air was thick with tension as he faced a semicircle of stern faces, the highest echelons of Earth's military and civilian government. Joseph took a deep breath and began. He spoke of Pixis, of the Tzenkethi's desperate plea, of the nanite horror they had locked away. He described the Doomsday Swarm in chilling detail, painting a picture of a ravenous, unstoppable tide that would reduce planets to barren rocks and stars to cinders. Ridiculous! Admiral Blackwell's voice cut through the silence like a knife. You expect us to believe this fairy tale? The Tzenkethi are notorious liars. This Doomsday Swarm is nothing more than a transparent ploy to keep our battleships out of the fight. Joseph met the Admiral's steely gaze. And if it's not, if the swarm is real and we deploy the Tempests, we won't just lose the war. We'll lose everything. The only thing we'll lose is our chance to end this conflict decisively, Blackwell snapped. The Slasrithi are on the verge of overrunning the Tzenkethi. If their empire falls, we're next. We must act now, with overwhelming force, to secure humanity's place in the galaxy. Ah yes, your mysterious friend, the Admiral sneered. And where, pray tell, is the proof of this claim? For all we know, this Pixis is a Tzenkethi agent, sent to sow fear and doubt in our ranks. I cannot divulge my source, he said at last, but I stake my reputation, my life, on the truth of his words. Blackwell leaned back in his chair, a triumphant smirk playing across his lips. "Then we have nothing more to discuss. The decision rests with the civilian leadership. I trust they will see the wisdom in not allowing the ravings of a single man to dictate the course of this war." As the room began to clear, Joseph caught the eye of the defense minister. The man's face was lined with worry, his brow furrowed in thought. For a moment, their gazes locked, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then the minister was gone, swept away in the tide of departing officials. Joseph sat alone in the briefing room, the weight of billions of lives pressing down on his shoulders. He had played his hand, laid bare the terrible choice before them. Now, all he could do was pray that those in power would heed his warning, before it was too late. Joseph's heart raced as he slipped through the darkened streets of the Tzenkethi capital, his mind still reeling from the meeting with Earth's leaders. He knew he needed proof, something tangible to convince them of the Doomsday Swarm's existence, and there was only one place he could find it. Pixis was waiting for him at the rendezvous point, his normally vibrant blue skin ashen with fear. "Are you certain about this, Joseph?" he whispered. "If we're caught—" Joseph nodded grimly. "We have no choice. They won't believe us without evidence." The journey to the vault was a blur of twisting corridors and shadowed alcoves, Pixis leading them through the labyrinthine depths of the Tzenkethi's most secure facility. As they approached the final door, Joseph noticed his friend's hands trembling as he keyed in the access code. The door hissed open, revealing a cavernous chamber that stretched out before them. Row upon row of obsidian-black canisters lined the walls, each one containing a dormant portion of the nanite swarm. In the center of the room stood a towering machine, its surface etched with ancient glyphs that seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light. "The deactivation device," Pixis murmured, his voice echoing in the eerie stillness. "The only thing that can stop the swarm once it's released." Joseph stepped closer, his eyes widening as he took in the machine's battered, rusted exterior. "It looks damaged." Pixis nodded, his expression grim. "It was nearly destroyed in the ancient war. We've been trying to repair it, but—" He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the rows of canisters. A chill ran down Joseph's spine as the implications sank in. What happens if the swarm is released before the device is fixed? "Extinction," Pixis whispered, his voice barely audible. "The swarm would consume everything in its path, every organic molecule, until the galaxy is nothing but dust." Joseph hesitated for a split second, torn between the need for more information and the urgent need to escape. But as the sound of pounding footsteps grew closer, he knew he had no choice. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a narrow, claustrophobic passage that twisted and turned through the bowels of the facility. Joseph's lungs burned as he ran, his mind racing with the knowledge of what he had seen. At last, he emerged into the cool night air, gasping for breath as he made his way to the hidden ship that would take him back to Earth. As he settled into the pilot's seat, he closed his eyes, the image of those obsidian canisters seared into his mind. He had his proof now, but would it be enough? Could he convince Earth's leaders of the danger before it was too late? As the ship lifted off, Joseph knew one thing for certain. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance and time was running out. The heavy wooden doors of the United Nations Security Council chamber swung open with a groan, revealing Joseph standing before the horseshoe-shaped table. The representatives of the world's most powerful nations turned to face him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Joseph walked to the front of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He placed a small device on the table and tapped a button. The room darkened as a holographic projection flickered to life, casting an eerie blue glow over the faces of the assembled dignitaries. Joseph's hushed conversation with Pixis played out before them, the Tzenkethi's words heavy with fear and urgency. The council members leaned forward, transfixed by the rows of black canisters and the ancient towering machine at the heart of the vault. As the recording ended, the lights came up, revealing a room full of stunned faces. For a moment no one spoke, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air like a physical presence. Then the US representative cleared his throat. "This is disturbing, to say the least," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "But how can we be sure this recording is genuine? It could be an elaborate fake, designed to mislead us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Joseph felt a surge of frustration. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the French representative chimed in. "I must agree with my American colleague," she said, her accented voice sharp. "The Tzenkethi are known for their deception. This could be a ploy to keep our battleships out of the fight." Joseph slammed his hand on the table, the sudden noise making several council members jump. "Don't you understand?" he said, his voice rising. "If the Doomsday Swarm is real, and we deploy the Tempests, we're not just risking the war, we're risking the entire galaxy." But even as he spoke, Joseph could see the doubt in their eyes. The Admiral's arguments, whispered in back rooms and private meetings, had taken root. He was losing them. Suddenly the chamber doors burst open, and a figure stumbled into the room flanked by startled UN security guards. It was Pixis, his clothing torn and his face bruised, but his eyes blazing with determination. "I have proof," he said, his voice shaking as he held up a data crystal. "Sensor readings, energy signatures, even a sample of the dormant swarm, everything you need to verify the truth of what we've told you." The room fell silent as Pixis limped to the center of the chamber, every eye fixed on the small, glittering object in his hand. "I barely escaped with my life," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "My own people have branded me a traitor for coming here. But I had to make you understand." Joseph stared at his friend, a lump forming in his throat. He knew the risks Pixis had taken, the sacrifices he had made. In that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude and respect for the Tzenkethi who had risked everything to stand by his side. As the council members crowded around Pixis, eagerly examining the data he had brought, Joseph saw the realization dawn on their faces. The Doomsday Swarm was no mere legend or scare tactic. It was a very real, very present danger. The debate that followed was intense, voices rising and falling as the representatives grappled with the enormity of the situation. But this time there was a difference. This time they understood the true nature of the threat they faced. Joseph leaned back in his chair, exhaustion and relief warring within him. They had won a crucial battle, but he knew the war was far from over. As the debate raged on in the Security Council chamber, an aide slipped quietly into the room, a look of grave concern etched on his face. He made his way to the presiding chair, leaning in to whisper urgently in her ear. The chair's eyes widened, her face paling as she listened to the news. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the clamor, "I have just received word that the situation has escalated. A Slasrithi surprise attack has dealt a devastating blow to the Tzenkethi fleet. Their homeworld now lies vulnerable." A hush fell over the room, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on each representative. Suddenly Pixis's communicator chirped, a coded message flashing across the screen. His hands trembled as he read the words, a look of pure terror washing over his features. "The Tzenkethi military," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're preparing to activate the Doomsday Swarm." Chaos erupted in the council chamber. Representatives shouted over each other, some demanding an immediate strike against the Tzenkethi, others pleading for a diplomatic solution. Amidst the pandemonium, a quiet voice rose above the din. Dr. Emilia Vasquez, a petite woman with intelligent eyes, stood calmly at the center of the room. "There may be another way," she said, her voice steady. "A small covert team could infiltrate the Tzenkethi homeworld, sabotage the swarm's activation mechanism. Buy us time to find a peaceful resolution." Joseph leaned forward, his mind racing. It was a desperate plan fraught with risk, but it might be their only chance. "I'll lead the mission," he said, rising to his feet. Pixis stood as well, his jaw set. "I'm coming with you." As the council dissolved into fresh arguments over the merits of the plan, Joseph and Pixis slipped out of the chamber. They moved quickly through the halls, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. In the hangar bay, a sleek black ship awaited them, state-of-the-art stealth technology designed for the most sensitive of missions. They boarded in silence, the gravity of their task weighing heavily on their shoulders. As the ship lifted off, Joseph stared out the viewport at the receding Earth. Somewhere out there a doomsday clock was ticking, and with each passing second, the galaxy edged closer to annihilation. The ship sliced through the void, a silent arrow speeding toward the heart of the Tzenkethi Empire. Joseph and Pixis sat in the cockpit, the tension between them palpable. "Do you think we can do this?" Pixis asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Joseph didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the stars streaking past, each one a reminder of the countless lives hanging in the balance. "We have to," he said finally. "There's no other choice." Joseph placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We'll stop them," he said, his voice firm. "We'll find a way." As the ship hurtled onward, Joseph's thoughts turned to the task ahead. The Tzenkethi homeworld would be heavily guarded, the swarm's activation site a fortress. They would need all their skill, all their cunning, to even stand a chance. But even as the enormity of the challenge loomed before them, Joseph felt a flicker of hope. They had beaten impossible odds before, he and Pixis. They had stood together in the face of darkness and emerged triumphant. And now, with the fate of the galaxy on the line, they would do so again. The stealth ship sliced through the void, gliding silently towards the Tzenkethi homeworld. Joseph and Pixis sat tensely in the cockpit, scanning the dense asteroid belt that encircled the planet. "There," Joseph said, pointing to a large pockmarked rock. "That's our cover." Pixis nodded, guiding the ship into the asteroid's shadow. As they approached, the sensors pinged an alert. "I'm picking up an unusual energy signature," Pixis said, frowning at the display. "It's coming from that mining facility." Joseph peered at the abandoned structure clinging to the asteroid's surface. Could be a trap. "Or it could be important," Pixis countered. "We can't afford to leave any stone unturned." Reluctantly, Joseph agreed. They docked at the facility, the ship's clamps latching onto the airlock with a metallic clunk. The interior was pitch black, the air stale and thick with dust. Joseph and Pixis activated their suit lights, the beams cutting through the darkness. They pressed deeper into the facility, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Suddenly, Pixis stopped, his light fixed on a nondescript door. "There's something behind here," he said, his voice tight. "The energy readings are off the charts." The door opened with a hiss, revealing a hidden laboratory. Strange machines lined the walls, pulsing with a sickly green light. Pixis hurried to a console, his fingers flying over the controls. His face paled as he read the data scrolling across the screen. "Joseph," he whispered, horror dawning in his eyes, "this is a research station. They've been enhancing the swarm." Pixis nodded grimly. "And harder to control if they deploy this." A piercing alarm shattered the air. Red lights flashed as a countdown appeared on the screens. "They're preparing a test," Pixis shouted over the noise. "We have to stop it." They raced through the lab, searching frantically for the control room. Joseph spotted it first, a reinforced door at the far end of the facility. But as they approached, his heart sank. The door was sealed, a complex locking mechanism barring their way. "I can hack it," Pixis said, already connecting his device, "but I need time." Joseph stood guard, his weapon drawn as Pixis worked feverishly. The seconds ticked by, the countdown nearing 0. With a triumphant shout, Pixis cracked the lock. The door slid open, revealing a single Tzenkethi technician hunched over a console. The technician spun, reaching for a weapon, but Joseph was faster. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from the technician's hand. "I bought the test," Pixis demanded, aiming his own weapon. "Now!" The technician laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Too late," he sneered. "The enhanced swarm is already on its way to the homeworld. Joseph's blood ran cold. He exchanged a look of pure terror with Pixis. Without a word, they turned and ran, sprinting back to their ship. As they blasted away from the asteroid, Joseph gripped the controls with white knuckles. "We have to warn them," he said, his voice shaking. "We have to stop this before it's too late." The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and the clock was ticking. As the stealth ship neared the Tzenkethi homeworld, the distant twinkle of stars was suddenly blotted out by a horrifying vista. Joseph and Pixis stared in mute shock at the grim spectacle before them. Countless Tzenkethi and Slastrithi warships clashed in a titanic battle, the void alight with the hellish glow of weapons fire. Twisted metal and frozen corpses drifted amidst the chaos, a silent testament to the ferocity of the struggle. Navigating gingerly through the floating graveyard, Joseph flinched as a chunk of wreckage ricocheted off their hull. Suddenly, the comm system crackled to life, a harsh voice filling the cockpit. "Pixis, you traitorous worm," Admiral Jean snarled, his battle-scarred face looming on the view-screen. "Why have you returned, and with a human no less?" Pixis swallowed hard, meeting Jean's piercing gaze. "Admiral, I beg you, the enhanced swarm must not be released. It will consume us all, Tzenkethi and Slastrithi alike. Please stand down before it's too late." Jean's cruel laughter echoed through the ship. "You fool. I ordered the swarm's enhancement myself. It is our only hope for victory, our last chance to save our people from annihilation." As Pixis reeled from the revelation, Jean turned to an unseen subordinate. "Release the swarm." A lone missile streaked from Jean's command ship, arcing towards the planet below. Acting on pure instinct, Joseph fired their ship's weapons, the missile vanishing in a blinding flash. "Destroy them!" Jean roared, his face contorted with rage. The space around them erupted with enemy fire, the stealth ship twisting and diving as Joseph pushed it to its limits. Pixis, his hands flying over the console, desperately tried to evade the onslaught. As they wove through the maelstrom of destruction, a chilling realization struck Pixis like a physical blow. "Joseph," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Jean's ship wasn't the only one. The swarm. It's been launched from multiple sites on the planet." Joseph's knuckles whitened on the controls, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. The stakes had just risen to unimaginable heights. If they failed, if the enhanced swarm spread unchecked, there would be no refuge, no escape, only the cold, inescapable embrace of oblivion. With a heavy heart, Joseph watched Pixis's figure recede into the distance as he guided the stealth ship towards the Tzenkethi homeworld surface. The weight of their desperate plan hung in the air, a last-ditch effort to save not just the Tzenkethi, but the entire galaxy from the ravenous hunger of the swarm. As he pierced the planet's atmosphere, Joseph's breath caught in his throat. The once vibrant landscape had been transformed into a hellish nightmare. The swarm, a seething mass of black nanobots, spread across the surface like a malignant growth, devouring everything in its path. Cities that had stood for millennia crumbled to dust, their inhabitants' screams echoing through the ship's comms. Joseph's hands clenched on the controls, his jaw set with determination. Guided by Pixis's intel, he zeroed in on the first launch site, a heavily fortified military compound nestled in the heart of a sprawling industrial complex. As he approached, the compound's defenses sprang to life. Turrets swiveled to track his ship, their muzzles glowing with deadly energy. Joseph's fingers flew over the console, activating the stealth ship's advanced countermeasures. The vessel shimmered and vanished from sight, slipping past the defenses like a ghost. The compound's outer perimeter was heavily guarded, Tzenkethi soldiers in sleek black armor patrolling the grounds. Joseph moved silently, using the ship's advanced sensors to map their positions. When an opening presented itself, he struck. His weapon flashed, a burst of searing energy cutting through the guards like a scythe. Alarms blared as he sprinted for the compound's entrance, the soldiers' shouts and the pounding of their boots echoing behind him. Inside the compound was a maze of corridors and chambers, each one leading deeper into the heart of the facility. Joseph moved with a purpose, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of threat. At last, he reached the central chamber, a vast, cavernous space filled with rows upon rows of missiles. Each one was a sleek, black cylinder, its surface etched with glowing Tzenkethi glyphs. Joseph's heart sank as he realized the truth. Each missile was filled with the deadly, enhanced swarm. There was no time to disable them safely. The compound's defenders were closing in, their shouts growing louder with each passing second. Joseph's mind raced, searching for a solution. His eyes fell on the reactor, a pulsing, glowing orb at the center of the chamber. An idea formed, desperate and dangerous. He sprinted to the reactor, his fingers flying over the control panel. The reactor began to whine, its light growing brighter and brighter. Joseph set the overload sequence, knowing it would destroy the base and the missiles within, but it would also release a massive electromagnetic pulse, one that could knock out power across the planet. It was a gamble, but one he had to take. As the reactor reached critical mass, Joseph turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears. The explosion was deafening, a searing white light that seemed to consume the world. Joseph felt the shockwave lift him off his feet, hurling him through the air like a rag doll. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs. As he struggled to his feet, he saw the compound collapsing in on itself, the missiles and the swarm within consumed by the inferno. But in the distance, he could see the lights of the cities flicker and die, the electromagnetic pulse sweeping across the planet like a wave. Joseph staggered back to the stealth ship, his body aching and his mind reeling. He had struck a blow against the swarm, but at what cost? And what of Pixis, alone on the Admiral's ship, risking everything to find the key to stopping the nanite plague? As he lifted off, the ruined landscape of the Tzenkethi homeworld falling away beneath him, Joseph could only pray that his friend would succeed. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and time was running out. In the cold void of space, Pixis stood before the airlock of Admiral Jan's command ship, his heart pounding in his chest. The Tzenkethi civilian leaders had risked everything to get him this far, their lives forfeit if their treachery was discovered. The airlock hissed open, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. Pixis stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The ship was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the engines. He moved silently through the corridors, his mind racing. Somewhere on this ship were the biometric codes he needed, the keys to activating the kill switch that could stop the swarm. But he knew he would have to face Admiral Jan to get them. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Jan was a legend among the Tzenkethi military, a ruthless tactician who had never lost a battle. Pixis had served under him once, years ago, and the memory still haunted him. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. The civilian leaders had provided him with a schematic of the ship, and he used it to navigate the twisting corridors. At last he reached the bridge, a vast circular chamber dominated by a massive view screen. Admiral Jan stood at its center, his back to the door, his gaze fixed on the raging battle outside. Jan turned slowly, his face a mask of cold fury. "Pixis," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I should have known you would betray us." "So you're the one who betrayed our people," Pixis shot back. "The swarm will destroy everything, Jan. There won't be a Tzenkethi empire left to rule." He reached for his weapon, but Pixis was faster. He fired, the bolt of energy slamming into Jan's chest. The Admiral staggered, his eyes wide with shock. But he didn't fall. With a roar of rage, he charged, his own weapon blazing. Pixis dove for cover, the bolts searing the air around him. The two Tzenkethi fought, their weapons flashing in the dim light of the bridge. Pixis was a skilled combatant, but Jan was a force of nature, his every move driven by a lifetime of battle. Pixis felt his strength waning, his body battered and bruised, but he couldn't give up. The fate of the galaxy depended on him. With a final desperate effort he lunged, his weapon forgotten. He grabbed Jan's arm, twisting it savagely. The Admiral howled in pain, his weapon clattering to the floor. Pixis pressed his advantage, his hands closing around Jan's throat. The Admiral struggled, his eyes bulging, but Pixis held on, his grip like iron. At last Jan went limp, his body sagging to the floor. Pixis stood over him, his chest heaving, his heart pounding in his ears. He had the codes. Now he just had to hope that Joseph had succeeded in his mission, that the swarm's advance had been slowed, and that together they could find a way to activate the kill switch and end this nightmare once and for all. But as he turned to leave the bridge, a cold dread settled in his stomach. The battle outside the viewscreen was still raging, the Slasrithi ships pressing their advantage, and on the planet below, the swarm continued its relentless march, consuming everything in its path. Time was running out, and the fate of the galaxy hung by a thread. Pixis could only pray that he and Joseph would be enough, that their desperate gamble would pay off. Because if they failed, there would be nothing left to save. Joseph raced through the crumbling remains of the Tzenkethi capital, his heart pounding as the relentless tide of the swarm surged ever closer. The nanobots seethed and roiled, a nightmare made real, consuming all in their path. He ducked into a collapsing alleyway, the echoes of distant screams chasing at his heels. His comm crackled, Pixis's strained voice cutting through the static. "Joseph, the second launch site, it's a bunker deep underground. You have to stop it." Joseph gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on his weapon. Understood. The entrance to the bunker loomed before him, a gaping maw in the planet's surface. Joseph plunged into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air grew thick and heavy, the weight of the planet pressing down on him as he descended deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels. The corridors twisted and turned, a maze of shadow and echoing silence. Joseph's nerves stretched to the breaking point, every flicker of movement, every distant sound setting his heart racing. He pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that every second counted. At last he reached the central chamber, a vast cavernous space filled with towering machinery. But his heart sank as he saw the telltale swarming of the nanobots, the swarm already overrunning the chamber. A cold realization washed over him. The launch had already begun. Joseph sprinted to the control console, his fingers flying over the keys. The screens flashed red, warnings blaring, but he shut them out, focusing only on his desperate task. With seconds to spare, he inputted the final command, a silent prayer on his lips. The bunker shuddered, the roar of rockets filling the air. But instead of streaking towards their targets, the missiles veered off course, arcing harmlessly into the upper atmosphere. Joseph watched the screens, his breath held, as one by one they detonated, far from the planet's surface. A moment of relief, of triumph, but it was short-lived. The swarm, as if sensing his presence, began to converge on his location. The nanobots seethed and swirled, a living tide of hunger and destruction. Joseph backed away, his weapon raised, knowing it was futile. Above, on Admiral Jan's command ship, Pixis moved like a ghost through the corridors. His knowledge of Tzenkethi protocols allowed him to bypass security, to slip unseen towards his target. Admiral Jan stood at the center of the room, his face contorted with rage and madness. "Pixis," he spat, "you dare betray your own people?" Pixis stepped forward, his voice steady. "You're the one who has betrayed us, Admiral. The swarm will destroy everything. It must be stopped." Jan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The swarm is our salvation, our key to supremacy. I will not let you stand in the way of the Tzenkethi's destiny." He lunged at Pixis, and the two clashed in a vicious dance of combat. They traded blows across the bridge, the fate of billions hanging in the balance. Pixis fought with the strength of desperation, but Jan was a formidable opponent. The Admiral drove him back step by step, until Pixis found himself pinned against the containment controls. In a last desperate gamble, Pixis slammed his hand down on the control panel. Alarms blared as the containment fields fell away, the bridge suddenly exposed to the deadly vacuum of space. Jan's eyes widened in horror as he realized what was happening. He scrabbled for purchase, but it was too late. The Admiral was yanked off his feet, pulled inexorably towards the gaping void. Pixis lunged forward, his hand closing around the biometric key hanging from Zan's neck. The chain snapped as he pulled it free, just as the Admiral disappeared into the darkness of space. He barely made it, the pod blasting free just as the ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light. But even as he slumped back in his seat, the biometric key clutched in his hand, Pixis's thoughts were with Joseph, his friend, alone on the planet's surface, facing the full might of the swarm. Joseph stood his ground as the nanobots surged towards him, a seething, roiling mass of hunger and destruction. His weapon was empty, his options exhausted. He closed his eyes, preparing for the end, but even as the swarm closed in, Joseph's thoughts were clear. He had fought to the last, had given everything to stop this nightmare. And though it might claim him, he knew that Pixis would carry on the fight. The galaxy's fate rested in his friend's hands now, and Joseph could only hope that it would be enough. The swarm surged forward, and darkness claimed him. Joseph clenched his eyes shut as the swarm closed in, the seething mass of nanobots mere inches from his skin. He could feel their hunger, their insatiable need to consume and destroy. In that moment, he knew his fight was over. He had given everything, had pushed himself to the very limits of human endurance. But it hadn't been enough. The galaxy would fall, and he would be just one more victim in the swarm's relentless march. But then, just as the first nanobots began to brush against his skin, a blinding light erupted from the direction of the Tzenkethi temple. It was a light unlike anything Joseph had ever seen, a pure, radiant energy that seemed to fill the entire sky. The swarm, caught in the midst of its advance, shuddered and writhed as if in pain. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The nanobots, their deadly purpose erased, fell to the ground like a black rain. They lay motionless in the streets, in the ruins of buildings, in the very air itself. A silence fell over the planet, a stillness so profound that Joseph could hear his own heartbeat. Slowly, hardly daring to believe, he emerged from the bunker. The city that had once teemed with life now stood eerily quiet, the only movement the gentle stirring of the wind. He walked through the streets, his footsteps echoing in the silence, taking in the scene of utter devastation. In the days that followed, as the galaxy struggled to come to terms with what had happened, the full story began to emerge. Pixis, with the help of a small group of loyal Tzenkethi, had managed to fight his way to the temple. There, using the biometric codes he had wrested from Admiral Jan, he had activated the kill switch, a fail-safe mechanism built into the very heart of the swarm. It had been a desperate gamble, one that had very nearly been too late. But it had worked. The swarm, the nightmare that had haunted the galaxy for so long, was gone. The Tzenkethi and the Slasrithi, their forces decimated and their worlds in ruins, had no choice but to agree to a fragile peace. The United Nations, recognizing the role that Joseph and Pixis had played, hailed them as heroes, the saviors of the galaxy. But even as the accolades poured in, a troubling discovery was made. The Tzenkethi's research into the swarm, it turned out, had not been limited to their homeworld. Hidden laboratories, scattered across the galaxy, continued their work in secret, each one a ticking time bomb waiting to unleash a new wave of horror. For Joseph and Pixis, the fight was far from over. Their bond forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal, they embarked on a new mission, to hunt down and destroy these remnants of the swarm before they could be used again. It was a task that would take them to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, a journey fraught with danger at every turn. Aboard a sleek new stealth ship, Joseph and Pixis set out into the unknown. The stars stretched out before them, each one a potential hiding place for the swarm's insidious legacy. They knew they might never be able to rest, that the threat would always linger just beyond the horizon. But they also knew that as long as they stood together, as long as there were those willing to fight for what was right, there was always hope, even in the face of the greatest darkness, the HFY. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.